Good evening, students. This is a presentation over the information in Chapter 1, which is called Thinking Rhetorically. What is rhetorical thinking? It is a habit of mind. It's about listening and searching for understanding. It's also about the need to really understand where you're coming from before you try to persuade people that you have a point. And finally, it involves a willingness to hear and collaborate with other people. One of the most important rhetoricians of the 20th century is Wayne Booth. He's been very influential for pretty much every single composition textbook that you have read, because nearly all of those authors were trained by Wayne Booth or one of Wayne Booth's proteges. He referred to rhetoric as the art of persuasion. And he really explored this theme around the time of 9/11 because he was aware of the degree to which language could actually make things better instead of causing conflict. And as we moved into war on Iraq after 9/11, Wayne Booth became even more convinced of the power of language and rhetoric to prevent conflict. Because rhetoric, being the art of persuasion, has got to be based on common ground, mutual understanding, seeing each other's point of view, but that through careful persuasion you could prevent serious conflict. And without conflict, you just can't have war. So in some ways he was being super optimistic, but it was very interesting, his connection of persuasion to nonviolence. And the kind of things he came up with as far as how do you make rhetoric an ethical, careful thing is to start with listening. You start by listening to the other side, really deeply, really intensely listening to them and hearing them. Put your personal disagreement or biases to the side. Do not let them inform what you hear. Listen to the person in front of you and what they have to say. And after they're finished, take a look and try to find, okay, what are areas we actually have mutual understanding? What are some common ground that we've got? Only after you've done that can you really write effective rhetoric. And then the other great rhetorician of the 20th century, or one of the other great ones, was Kenneth Burke. And he came up with the idea of the rhetorical parlor. Basically, he is the one who came up with the idea that you're not just writing in an isolated case. You're writing in response to what other people have written, and someday others will write in response to what you wrote. And he likened it to a party. And basically it's like when you go to a party, held in a parlor of some sort, you'll see all sorts of conversations going on, very heated discussions, and you may gravitate to see what the deal is, but none of the people in that discussion are going to stop to fill you in. You're going to have to listen long and hard till you know what they're discussing. And only after you know that can you contribute your 2 cents and actually have it mean something in the conversation. That is writing. You get to understand what all is going on around the topic before you contribute your 2 cents to the conversation. And that it's also important to understand that this conversation, it's going to keep going after you leave the house. It's going to keep going after you are done with the party. But your contribution will remain. And other people make contributions as well after you have gone. And in that way, I want you guys to think of your writing as not an isolated incident, but it's kind of part of a longer, larger conversation that is being had about different topics. Alright, so questions to help you generate some rhetorical thinking is, what is it you want to get across the audience? What is the thing you want them to understand? Okay? And then you need to take a look at your audience and you need to figure out, okay, what do I need to show them so that I will be seen as knowledgeable and credible by their standards? Because if they don't think that I'm knowledgeable and credible, they're not going to listen. Okay, and after you've done that, it's time to look at the audiences and also the information sources that they have and that you have. And, what can be done, and ask yourself what can be done to show respect to the audiences and the information sources. And it's important to understand that what we mean by this is showing respect to information sources means including multiple points of view from multiple pieces of information in your argument or in your work before you get into the argument proper. You need to acknowledge that the audiences have different points of view than you're arguing in favor of, and that they have different sources of information that you're using, and you got to show respect to that before you move into your piece. Because if you don't show respect for what they know about the topic, or think that they know about the topic, you're going to have a very hard time getting them to listen to you. And then finally, what does the audience care about? What are their values? And how can you show that you care about those values too? How can you prove to your audience that you have their best interests at heart? So in addition to the topic you're discussing and the evidence to back it up, you need to address all of these questions before you start. Now, there are different habits of rhetorical thinking, and the first one is to listen. You're going to take it in, and you're going to really understand what the other side has to say. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you are talking to them in the middle of a speech, or that you are, writing specifically in first person to them in your work. What it means is you've read what the other side has to say, and you understand where they're coming from. And the reason you do this is to establish goodwill between you and your audience, and it proves that their views are important enough for you to take into consideration, and it shows that you have respect for them as a person. So, basically, how do you show respect? By listening. Alright, another thing that you're going to do is actually hear what they say and think about why they're saying it. Don't rush to judgment. Put that internal censor on the side. Don't just wait to talk or wait to get your point across. Listen and hear. Persuasive communication accounts for other points of view, and you also will have counter arguments that you will have to contend with. And that's part of it. That's part of hearing what they have to say and understanding why they're saying it. And you got to understand your context. You got to understand where your audience is coming from. And also, in this process of hearing, you're also going to listen to figure out what motivates them towards their viewpoint. What is the thing that's driving them? Okay, so in addition to hearing, we have deciding what you think and why. This part is where, now that you know what the other people have to say, you need to dig into what you have to say. You need to dig into your beliefs and your position. You really need to examine other points of view that they have, with an understanding that eventually their point of view is going to affect yours. Sometimes when you see their other point of view, your own position is going to clarify, or it's going to become more refined, or it's going to adapt, but it will become more itself. The position that you have will be more like this. It will be more communicable and more easy to articulate because it'll be clearer and more refined. Listening to them and thinking about your own point of view helps you understand your motivations for getting stuff across. Maybe you really are motivated by what's best in the neighborhood. Or maybe you're motivated because you just don't like your neighbor. If you are giving a speech about what people can be allowed to put in their backyards and why. Are you motivated for the good of the neighborhood, or are you motivated because your neighbors have a really disgusting statue of Pikachu that's 10 feet tall and you don't want it there? And be honest about your motivations. And then finally, make sure your position's fair and appropriate. If they have a whole worldview you've never considered because you've never experienced life that way, you're going to really have to think through it in order to make sure that what you have to say in your position is fair, not just to you, but for everyone involved, and that is appropriate to the situation at hand. Do your homework. Which is to say, research what other people have to say, and research more about what people who agree with you and what they have to say. Do your homework. Because ultimately, your thinking needs to reflect more than just your own opinion. It needs to reflect the vast amount of discussion on this topic that has come before. Doing your homework is the equivalent of that part where you walk into the rhetorical parlor and you're listening hard to figure out the conversation. That's part of your doing your homework. And then whatever you have to contribute is going to reflect not just what you think, but the discussion at large and the ideas in play. Whenever you find information, break it down and evaluate it. What's good information? What's bad information? What's relevant? What isn't? And then when you get the ones that are the most relevant and the most useful and the most important, synthesize them together. Okay? Blend the useful parts of the information into something coherent that will then inform your thinking. And while you're doing that part of researching your own ideas, pay attention to the rhetoric. Why is it that this particular article really resonated with you, but another article did not? Especially if they're saying similar things. Because the articles that convince you or affect you are the articles with rhetoric that spoke to you. And there's no good reason not to study that for like a map in how to do good rhetoric. If something personally affects you and personally touches on what you believe and kind of persuades you to either listen to another side or maybe to rethink of your own opinion, then that rhetoric was very powerful, and there's no reason not to crib from it and take techniques from it and see how it was put together, because that'll only make your own work stronger. Other habits: give credit, acknowledge the contributions and works of other people, because it shows good character. You're not just trying to claim you're a brilliant person, you're putting yourself in context of the larger discussion. And be imaginative. Sometimes you need, we're very obsessed. Like, Western culture is incredibly, and to a fault, obsessed with, quote, objectivity, quote, logic, quote, unemotional thinking, end quote. When really, effective communication involves all of those things, and when you choose to downplay or disrespect those aspects of thinking, the imaginative, the emotion-informed, the intuitive, you're missing out on an entire huge chunk of tools, a huge chunk of material for you to pull from, and tools that you can use to get there. Okay? We're talking about hunches and intuitions about your research. It's like I pointed out last week, how if you ever encounter an article that niggles at you, that you find disturbing, that you feel like something's off, you're just not sure why. That's a hunch. That's a feeling. But it's also the beginning of what probably be a very great analysis essay, because you're going to start poking into something and exploring something you think is interesting. I mean, one of the examples of the book is a student who decided he wanted to do a research report over basketball. So he started doing his research, and he did a lot of research with Sports Illustrated. But what he noticed is that sometime in the early 80s, the Sports Illustrated magazine started to change. The cover started to change. We went from seeing entire teams playing or shots of people playing on the field to individual portraits of superstar athletes. And what he discovered is that the rise of the star athlete was integrally tied to Sports Illustrated's shift from looking at teams to looking at individuals. And that was an excellent and interesting paper. And it's only because he noticed that difference and really wanted to know why. It was a hunch, and it was brilliant. It ended up giving a really brilliant piece. So Lunsford goes to great extent to show us how Watson and Crick very carefully framed their argument that DNA exists and is a thing, in showing difference to the information in the field thus far, so that their information would be accepted rather than immediately rejected. And the problem with that is that for a chapter that's really obsessed with giving credit where credit is due, somehow she forgot to give credit to Rosalind Franklin, she's actually the one who first photographed DNA. She's actually the one who did the groundbreaking research on DNA. But her colleague Maurice Wilkins just stole her picture and her information and sent it to Watson and Crick and said, here, look at this. And they gave him tremendous amount of thanks for his contributions, but Franklin got ignored because Wilkins never admitted it was Franklin's work, and she didn't really get credit for her discoveries or contributions until like the last 10 years. So basically, I do not want to continue the tragedy of not giving credit where credit's due, so I just wanted to throw this in about Rosalind Franklin. And once more, to recount the habits of rhetorical thinking, listen, take it in and really understand what the other people are saying, hear what they have to say and think about why they're saying it, then decide what you're thinking and why you think that. Make sure to do your homework, give credit where credit is due, and be imaginative when you present your ideas. And that is it for this week. Have a good one.